So is this the beginning of yet another international military engagement in the Middle East? And what will become of Syria if the Assad regime falls? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by author and investigative journalist Webster Tarpley. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
So, you know, you're a historian. You've been studying politics for decades, but you're also an economist. And you just wrote a book about multiple things that have to do with the economy. You proposed something different than what we've been hearing about, this fiscal cliff, this doomsday impending fiscal cliff. What do you suggest?
It's actually very simple. If you look at the U.S. debate about the so-called fiscal cliff is really a fraud. It's a term invented by helicopter Ben Bernanke of the Federal Reserve, so not a good thing. It's designed to stampede people. Here's the main idea. You don't need to have genocidal austerity by cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment benefits, food stamps in particular. There's one huge flow of wealth that has not ever been taxed in recent years. It's called Wall Street. If you look at the main zombie banks in Wall Street, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, they generally pay zero federal corporate income tax. That's one side. They pay nothing. Or over a period of 10 years, they might pay 1 or 2% at most. But the other thing is the turnover. In other words, they're buying and selling, they're trading, they're doing flash trading, high-frequency trading. They're doing 1 million trades per second on one computer, and they have many computers. There's no sales tax on any of that. The average person, to buy a pair of shoes or some clothing or some electronics, you're going to pay sales tax in America that ranges between 6% and 12%. It's just gone up again in California, which is a regressive tax. It's a terrible way to do things. Why not impose a sales tax on Wall Street? Call it the Wall Street sales tax. I think that makes a lot of sense. There was one between 1916 and 1966. There was a very small Wall Street sales tax. New York State still has a Wall Street sales tax, but they give it back. They give it back to the banks because the banks say, don't you dare tax us or we'll go to Jersey. So they caved in. There is still right now today a tiny tax on Wall Street turnover. It's 0.0000 something or other, and that goes to finance the Securities and Exchange Commission. So there's no doubt about the constitutionality. It's easy to collect. This stuff has to go across exchanges or be enforced in a court. And the amount, well, the turnover is in the quadrillions. 6 to 7 quadrillions of derivative stocks, bonds. You put a 1% tax on that, your revenue enhancement is probably in the area of many trillions. We don't know how many trillions because obviously the speculation would tend to go down if you put in such a tax. It just shows you how
false this narrative is imposing on us. You know, the shared sacrifice. You know, we need to cut across the board. It's really the epitome of the two-tiered justice system. But I did want to segue into Syria because I know I really want to get your input on this. We just heard NATO's Secretary General announcing these missile posts. I mean, what does this signify?
Well, that man is a bloody hypocrite. We saw him during Libya. His hands are dripping with blood. So he's coming forward as a great human rights champion. I was able to do a trip around Syria just a little bit more than a year ago. And on this network, on Russia Today, I said in an interview from Damascus, what's going on here are NATO death squads. That is the main thing that's always been the heart of the matter. Essentially, NATO has gone around and collected every jihadi, every Islamist fanatic, every misfit, every patsy from a stretch of land from Morocco to Indonesia, from Chechnya down to Somalia, over to Kosovo and so forth. And they've shipped them in, and they've given them weapons. And different countries have different groups, right? There's the Syrian National Council, which is the French DGSE, Secret Service, with money from Qatar. Most of these death squads are paid for by Saudi Arabia. They take orders over the television from a guy called Arur, who is a crazy fanatic. And now we've got the new one, which is the U.S.-backed one, the new Syrian National Coalition, a new puppet group paid for by the U.S., organized by Ambassador Robert Ford, who had been the U.S. ambassador to Damascus. He's a guy who learned the death squad technique from the past master, right, from Negroponte in Central America and then in Baghdad. And concerning this Syrian National Coalition, The head of that is a very interesting guy. He's an Anglo-Dutch agent. He's a British-Dutch agent. He's an executive of Royal Dutch Shell. He's a lobbyist for Royal Dutch Shell. He's kind of like Karzai. Remember Karzai in Afghanistan was Union Oil? This guy's Royal Dutch Shell. So there's nothing Syrian about this. In other words, these are foreign fighters. It's what would have been called the CIA secret army in the old days.
I wanted to play a couple clips that are just all too reminiscent of the Iraq lead-up. Let's play those real quick.
It should come as no shock, then, that since Saddam Hussein forced out the last inspectors in 1998, we have amassed much intelligence indicating that Iraq is continuing to make these weapons.
And today I want to make it absolutely clear to Assad and those under his command, the world is watching. The use of chemical weapons is and would be totally unacceptable. And if you make the tragic mistake of using these weapons, there will be consequences and you will be held accountable.
Unbelievable. So we see this, you know, this lead up, the propaganda really going strong. First of all, I never understood why weapons is a means to justify preemptive invasion on any country. But aside from that, why are we hearing this rhetoric now?
You get the impression that the NATO aggressive circles, what can we call them? The top imperialists in NATO want to bring this to some kind of a conclusion. The point of this has nothing to do with democracy. If you can smash the Syrian state and reduce that into chaos of the Libyan type, and you see, you go to Benghazi, Tobruk, Derna, you'll see a place where death squads rule. There is no government, right? It's a complete chaos and anarchy. They'd like to have that in Syria. Syria, of course, is more complex because you got 15% Christians of all different kinds. You've got Druzes, you've got Shiites, you've got Alawites, you've got any number of other different groups. So if you can shatter that society, then you've got complete chaos. And if you've done that, you've cut off the strategic depth of Hezbollah in Lebanon, you've deprived them of their supply routes, and you've also eliminated the main Arab or regional ally of Iran. And this is a process that never ends. In other words, it's subversion. It's not supposed to be heavy bombing, although it could easily become that. But the idea is to overthrow these countries one by one, and eventually they'll go on to Iran. The problem is it's an illusion. In other words, the people around Obama, the sort of Brzezinski school, as distinct from the neocon school, they delude themselves that by using these methods, they can do everything with color revolutions and subversion and cyber warfare, information warfare, cut off the television, economic sanctions, assassinations, drones, this entire package, and that they can avoid large-scale wars. The problem is sooner or later they're going to run into a country that will resist more aggressively. In other words, that will retaliate in the classic Cold War ways, and that might be Iran, or then it might also be Russia or China further on. So it's a blind alley, and I think the main thing is, how do you stop it? I would suggest two things. The one thing is a worldwide movement to bring in a peacekeeping force. There is an organism called the Collective Security Treaty Organization. This is sort of what filled the old Soviet space after the Warsaw Pact ended. So it's Russia, Kazakhstan, and some others. Why not have peacekeeping troops from the Collective Security Treaty Organization go in and separate the contenders inside Syria? It would be a way of saying, recognizing the fact that Syria belongs to the Russian sphere, more or less, in terms of the division of the world. The other thing, though, is if you look at who's destabilizing Syria, you see it's Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. Now, the thing about those places, or Jordan, similar, is that these are feudal monarchies, right? These are absolute monarchies of a type you don't find anywhere else in the world. They were about 400 or 500 years behind the time.
Also horrendous human rights abusers.
Absolutely. There's an article in the Washington Post today that 1/4 of the people in Saudi Arabia live in poverty. So you imagine this, a parasitical royal family of thousands of princes and princelings who live in the lap of luxury, and still, with all that oil money, they can't have a decent standard of living for 4 or 5 million. The question now is, when the revolution hits those places, right, Bahrain also, terrible human rights abuses, I think it might relieve the pressure on Syria if Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar were kept busy at home with their own problems, which they should pay attention to, rather than meddling in Syria.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. There's so much more to talk about. Thank you so much for coming and giving a little bit of insight on the convoluted situation. Webster Tarpley.